as long as the United States continues to exist, someone, somewhere, will always be screwed over. Someone, somewhere, will always be the victim of imperialist oppression. Whether it's the North Koreans who are living under brutal U.S. economic sanctions, or the Palestinians who are living under a brutal regime, the Israeli regime that Washington props up, or whether it's the colonized peoples within the United States itself, who realistically are always going to be subjugated under capitalism and the brutal U.S. police state for as long as the United States remains in existence. This is the reality that the reformists, that the imperial chauvinists will always refuse to admit, because they want to perpetuate this myth that even though the United States was built upon flawed foundations, even though the United States has had slavery and has had all of these problems, ultimately it's going to be able to work towards a better society, towards a just society, and ultimately the United States is worth keeping. But this is a lie, because the United States was founded on empire, and for that reason it's always going to exist as an empire. Even if the United States were to revert back to its pre-20th century state of being more isolated geopolitically within its own region, and if it were to withdraw all of its global forces, it would still exist in the form of an empire, because the United States in itself is a rogue British colony that broke away from Britain essentially for the purpose of being able to further expand westward. So what we're dealing with on the U.S. continent, on the American continent, they made it more of a U.S. continent after westward colonization. What we're dealing with is an internal form of imperialism, as well as an internal form of neocolonialism, where the natives and the Africans on this continent are subject to this regime which assimilates them into this economy where they're always going to be a step below the whites, disproportionately poorer than the whites, and where they're always going to be subject to discrimination by law enforcement, where they're always going to be subject to more violence by the capitalist police state. This is the reality that the reformists and the social chauvinists will always refuse to admit, because they want to believe that through reforms a just society can come about under a continuation of the U.S. government. But structurally, it's impossible, and I think we've been getting a hint of this in these last few years. At least I've been getting some good sense of it as I've evolved from being a Bernie Sanders social democrat to being a Marxist-Leninist. And what's given me the hint, what's woken me up from my past state of agreeing with the reformist view on the United States, is the fact that Bernie Sanders, AOC, Ilhan Omar, and Tulsi Gabbard, all of these progressive politicians ultimately agree with the idea of empire. They agree with the idea of continuing this illegal occupation of native territories. They agree with the idea of advancing U.S. interests, which entails things like the continued occupation of Palestine. It entails things like ongoing U.S. sanctions against the DPRK, which are and driving the DPRK's living standards drastically down. They agree with the idea of Cold War escalations against Russia and China, and Bernie Sanders, the supposed radical socialist, has himself said that Hugo Chavez was a dead communist dictator. This is Trumpian, McCarthyist, red-baiting language that's normalized among these kinds of progressive politicians, because ultimately progressivism, despite its veneer of wanting a just and humane society, is on the side of the United States. Its goal is to try to reform this U.S. settler colonial capitalist state so that the proletariat in the imperial core is able to enjoy more social benefits, but this is not going to be able to defeat imperialism. If anything, it would strengthen imperialism through placating the masses within the imperial core so that they're less inclined to resist global empire. And make no mistake, U.S. imperialism would continue both at home and abroad under any U.S. administration, because that is the nature of the United States. That is the nature of empire. Justice cannot come about until all of the stolen land is returned to the indigenous First Nations. That is the reality that we need to accept.